Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, first of all, Chris gave me a little bit of an introduction. I've started working in um, web analytics before Google Analytics was a thing. Um, Web Trends was kind of the first popular analytics platform. I worked with that a lot, Omniture a lot. Urchin is what Google bought to create Google Analytics, and I also used Urchin back in the day. So I've been at it for a long time, and I think for me it appeals to my, like, I am a tinkerer. I love solving problems. I'm fairly technical, but I love also the insights that analytics reveal about people. And we'll talk about that a little bit because that's one of the things that I'm excited about with what Google has done with GA4. At any time, I will be keeping an eye on chat. If you have questions along the way, I love questions. Um, I'm an adjunct professor at DU, and I always encourage my students to um, uh, politely interrupt with questions along the way, just because I think it makes it more lively if we can address people's needs and along the way. So what we're going to talk about today, I wanted to start by just explaining what GA4 is, because I think it's just important to know some of the foundations of what Google has tried to tackle with GA4, and then get into some of the reasons why I think it makes sense to switch sooner than later, or circumstances where it makes sense to switch sooner than later, and a little bit about planning the transition. The goal today is not to give you all the detail you need to actually plan out, like, here's what I'm going to like, here are all the steps I'm going to need to do, but I'm going to outline that. And Chris mentioned there is a handout that has some useful, basically a checklist of, here are the things I need to make sure that I'm covering. There will be time at the end for Q&A. I love digging into actual GA accounts, or looking at setup. So there will be time if you have specific circumstances you want to cover and look at the end. And I am available sort of past the hour, whatever that hour is where you are. So if we go a little bit over, that's okay with me. But the presentation portion plus some time for QA will happen over the next, where are we at right now? 54 minutes. So, okay, so what is GA4 exactly? So the first thing is, it's funny that Google calls it GA4, and I was like, when I heard that the first time, I was like, wait, there's a GA3. And as far as I know, they only start using the term GA3 when they came up with the name GA4, and it's it's kind of a weird approach to naming, because there has not actually been a significant like new version of GA until now. What they've done is they've incrementally made changes, and the probably the most important changes they've made are to the tag that you have to implement on websites. So they went from a synchronous tag to an asynchronous tag, and that happened, I think, around 2011. And that just meant that people had to replace their tags. And Universal Analytics gave the ability to track across different platforms in a way that we couldn't before. But each one of those was not like yes, you had to upgrade the tag sooner or later, but what you logged into and saw didn't change overnight. There was a pretty big change in the late aughts in that regard, but there was never like a, you have to upgrade and you have to have a plan for upgrading. The closest to that was, you're going to have to implement a new tag on the websites that you're tracking. So GA4 really is a completely new version, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So first of all, like, yes, it's called GA4, but it really, I mean, we have to think of it as a brand new product from Google. And I think of it really as two separate things. And one is that they've completely overhauled the data architecture and how data is collected. I mean, when I say how data is collected, you still do it. If you're using Tag Manager, you can still do it in Tag Manager, but the flexibility is game changing. And then there's a reporting interface on top of that, and we'll touch on. I mean, in summary, it's mediocre. We'll touch on some of the reasons why. So from a data standpoint, with the previous version of Google Analytics is mostly being referred to as Universal Analytics, and Google did come up with that name when they introduced it. And if you think of your tracking code, it starts with UA dash, and that stands for Universal Analytics. But this evolution, like this architecture of we have users and we have sessions and we have hits, and then there's different types of hits, that all dates all the way back to Urchin. The very early days, and that data architecture hasn't really changed. And the thing about that is that first of all, the idea of a session is sort of artificial. It's a time frame, it's time frame based, but the idea that this actually exists in the hierarchy of data has been sort of limiting, because there's a lot of circumstances where we don't think in terms of sessions. So we can certainly, if we decide that a session counts as a continuous activity with a gap of no more than 30 minutes, which is really what a session is, we can recreate that in GA4, and there is kind of an equivalent in GA4. But the limitation came from the fact that hits had specific types in this architecture. And so you had page views, you had transactions, there were a few other events, like page timing was a type of hit. But the ones that you'd be most familiar with are page views, transactions, or events. The events part is pretty confusing. I mean, the name events exists in GA4, but it means something completely different. So in GA4, we have users and we have events. And events are everything that basically, whenever we collect data, we are collecting an event. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Is like, if you just think, well, so the act of collecting data means that something happened, right? Like it's something happened that triggered an event. So everything really is an event. And then events have parameters. So events have names and they have parameters, versus the architecture of events in Universal Analytics was that events had categories, actions, and labels. And that was all just sort of tacked on to Universal Analytics. Now, everything can be in an event and anything can be an event. So there are standard parameters that we collect with events, and these are some of them. These are actually the default ones that exist with all events. There's some other standard parameters that exist with, like, for example, a page view event has some specific built-in parameters, but any event can have up to 25 additional parameters of your choosing. So an example of that would be that if I wanted to say on pages on my website, maybe I want to add the subdomain as a parameter because I have different subdomains on my website. I could choose to add that as a parameter. And then the most important thing is you get to make up your own. So I'm using, just because probably it's going to be familiar to many of you, because it's like the whole entire everybody with an internet connection across the world started playing Wordle for the most part. Maybe some of you haven't, but you're certainly familiar with it. So using this as an example, if I wanted to create, like, so let's say I'm the New York Times that bought Wordle and I want to create a complete Wordle event. Well, I can do that, and then I can add parameters to that. Well, how many guesses did it take to complete the Wordle? on the first try, how many yellows did the person get? How many greens did they get? You could add more of these. You could add them on the second try, the third try if you wanted. You could get as much detail as you want. What was the actual word? And what was the mean number of guesses? And you can see how like collecting this data is actually super useful if you're the New York Times, because now you can just directly in Google Analytics, you don't need to build your own custom system for figuring out engagement with Wordle. You can just straight in Google Analytics collect this data and report on it. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that. So that's what's really game changing, is they've simplified the hierarchy. We don't actually have like specific hit types. An event can be anything. All we have is our users and events, and then everything else like if we want to say, well, this is a session, we can define what a session means and organize data by sessions. I mentioned that reporting is mediocre, and let's talk a little bit about why I say that. This isn't necessarily a mediocre part of it. I think it's the user experience has a lot of room for improvement. When you go to a reporting tab in GA4, you're going to see a screen like this in most cases. There are some overview reports that have little widgets. Most reports look something like this. And where this thing I have highlighted, this little drop down, is where a lot of what you're used to seeing in Google Analytics is hidden. So like in this case, if I want to look at the page location, I can look at the page location. If I want to look at content group, I can look at content group. So there are a number of ways that I can look at engagement data on the website, but I have to go to this little drop down and click on it and see what's in there. Once you know to do that, not a huge deal, but just again a little bit less user friendly. I think just you have to do a little bit of hunting to look for what you're looking for. And if you're not super familiar with the kind of hierarchy of dimensions in Google Analytics, that can make it kind of hard, because you're not necessarily going to know which report to go to look for the thing that you're looking for. A couple of other things. So one that I think is just weird is GA4 evolved out of what was a project to create web and mobile properties in GA, essentially evolve Google Analytics to account for the fact that many organizations have both a web app and a web presence via HTML websites, and we want to be able to see the user engagement in both places. So, I mean, a good example would be if the New York Times introduced a Wordle app and you could play it online, or you can install the app, which seems probably inevitable that might happen, then you can have one place to be able to see interactions in Wordle on the New York Times website as well as via the app. The thing that I don't like is that a lot of the nomenclature has things like screen class, and I'm like, well, I'm just looking at a website site, like this is confusing. What does that even mean? And there's a ton of metrics and dimensions that are specific to mobile apps. So when you're browsing through metrics and dimensions, you'll see those as well. And I think it's too bad. Like, I think that it would be nice if they gave you the ability to say, I'm not tracking a mobile app, hide all the mobile app specific stuff. Another thing I don't like is that in reports you have to horizontal and vertical scroll for a lot of data, which is just, that's basic, like, user experience 101. Don't make people both horizontal and vertical scroll. Then, like, I don't know, I just sort of feel like it's still a work in progress. It's the default version of Google Analytics. If you go and create a Google Analytics account right now, it's going to be a GA4 account unless you specify otherwise, which is a little tricky to do. It's most people, well, when I talk to people that aren't super familiar with Google Analytics, a lot of times they just set up a GA4 property without realizing they could have still set up a universal analytics property. But all that said, it's not really all the way done yet, in my opinion. Like, when you look at reports like this, why is having this horizontal bar chart useful for looking at page titles? Like, to me, that's not a very useful visualization. The actual overall thing, like this is the equivalent of the page view report in Universal Analytics, and knowing how many page views they get over time is something I'd be interested in seeing, which is what they showed in Universal Analytics. The other thing that they do this in many reports where they correlate users to sessions or users to views. And newsflash, the more users you have, the more sessions you're going to have, and the more page views you have. Like, the idea of a visualization is it's supposed to help you understand something that's difficult to understand. But I think we all know intuitively that as users go up, whatever type of engagement we're tracking is likely to go up too. So that baffles my mind that they chose that as a default visualization in many cases. Another aspect of reporting is that if you were a power user of Universal Analytics, you were likely to have started creating a lot of your own custom reports to show combinations of dimensions that you couldn't show in regular reporting, like if you added your own custom dimensions and metrics to be able to report on those. That doesn't really exist anymore. You can do some customization in standard reporting, but there are some significant limitations to that. But they added this exploration section, and I guess what I've found is it's okay, this is a funny analogy, but maybe some of you can relate to it. Like, have you ever been in a situation where somebody brought out baked goods from a Mexican pastry shop, and you looked at them and you're like, wow, these look so good, and then you bite into it and it's like they all taste kind of the same. They taste a little bit like the cake I used to get in elementary school, sort of bland lard and sugar frosting and not a lot of flavor on the inside. This is kind of like that. You're like, oh, this looks so cool. I'm going to be able to do my, like, all this kind of dragging around of dimensions, metrics, and everything. But what I found is I often run into things that I'm just like, oh, this is not quite what I hoped it was going to be. So I say doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up. What I mean by that is I think Google is still struggling with the idea of, is the target market just sort of everyday small business owner, or is the target market like sort of data sciencey people that really want to dig into data? Because there are features that seem a little bit more geared towards the latter, but then there are significant limitations which make you think maybe they're trying to make it useful for everybody. And I think what they've done is sort of failed in the middle, that it's too complicated for everyday users and too limited for advanced users. A couple other things about reporting, and again, I'm emphasizing limitations here because the goal here is to understand sort of how you should be thinking about how much effort you're putting into GA4, whether or not you want to set it up in the first place, use it as your primary property. So a few things. There are also fewer visualization options. Like in Universal Analytics, you could do like bubble charts, you could do pivot tables. In standard reporting, you don't have those options. The custom dimensions and metrics aren't available in standard reporting, and we'll see that that's actually a pretty big limitation, because the ease with which you can create custom dimensions and metrics is a big improvement over Universal Analytics, and I think it's one of the sort of great strengths of GA4, but the fact that we can't use those dimensions and metrics in standard reporting. And when I say standard reporting, I mean like the navigation on the left where it says reports. Like if you click on that, you're not going to be able to see any of your custom dimensions and metrics. They'll be available in explorations, but not in those reports. Hopefully that's going to change. It seems weird to me that limitation exists. So then another one is some of the reports that you know and love, and you're a little weird if you love the behavior flow report, but it is useful. But landing pages, being able to report on site search. The site search data is in GA4, but there isn't a site search report yet. I think there will be. And certainly if somebody in the audience knows that they have added that since the last time I looked, ping me, because it is, or pop in a chat, but last I looked, you couldn't report on site search. The data is collected. It's actually a default. It's built in that it's collected. But on the plus side, every report can be customized in ways that, so while you can't pick your custom dimensions and metrics, you can actually change visualizations. You can change what reports exist. So for example, one thing that I like to do is if a site doesn't do e-commerce, I can get rid of e-commerce reporting, which is sort of nice. I mean, I think that reporting in Universal Analytics is pretty overwhelming. There's so many choices, and somebody that's not an advanced user looks at it and they're just like, I don't know where to go. I don't know where I'm supposed to look. In GA4, you can make the experience more tailored for like a given website. If there are reports that just don't make sense, you can get rid of them. And if there are reports you want to add, you can do that too. So that's really nice, and that includes navigation. So you can add your own. You can make customizations to report navigation. One thing that I think is too bad is that if you make those changes. You can't. There is no such thing as views, and I probably should have mentioned that because that is a limitation. So you couldn't have like a power user view and a basic user view and keep the navigation super simple for basic users, but have kind of everything plus the kitchen sink available for advanced users. That is not something that you can do. All right, so sort of summary before we move on. Reporting is mediocre. You can solve a lot of these problems with Google Data Studio. I love Google Data Studio. It keeps getting better and better. So a lot of the reporting limitations can be overcome there, but that means you need to have the expertise or the ability to get resources, resources with expertise to build out Data Studio reports. Okay, so reasons to switch and a few reasons not to switch. Before I go into specific reasons, one thing to mention is that I definitely advocate running them side by side. So if you're sitting here like, well, you know, I don't know, based on what you said about reporting and some other things, maybe I'll wait until it seems like it's more done. But there is no downside to running them side by side. I think, well, there's no technical downside to running them side by side. You do start to run into questions of where should I go to look? Like if you're investing time setting up GA4, it could inevitably happen that you create a new forum on your website and you create a goal in GA4, but you don't create it in Universal Analytics, but then you have goals in Universal Analytics that you haven't set up in GA4. And then it's like, yikes, there's, where do I go? Like that is a possibility. So not to say there's no possible downsides, but technically speaking, they run side by side just fine. And Google talked about upgrading. They've actually changed that language because so many people were concerned by it. You're not really upgrading. You're just creating a GA4 property that exists in parallel until you shut down your Universal Analytics property. There are a couple of weird exceptions to that. I've run into a few website management, like CMS platforms for managing website content that only allow either GA4 or Universal Analytics. But hopefully you're not. Those examples are few and far between. So hopefully that's not a circumstance that you're in. Okay, so reason number one for why I would advocate switching to GA4 is you're starting from scratch. You're setting up a brand new website for your business, a client's business. I mean, a brand new analytics account, not a brand new website, but you're setting up analytics. My opinion is that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages overall. Yes, there are limitations of reporting, but the thing is that Google will be sunsetting Universal Analytics. They haven't said anything about specific timeframes, but what they did when they introduced the asynchronous tracking tag that allowed for, and at the same time as introducing their asynchronous tracking tag, which I think was around 2011, they introduced new features that were available in analytics that you could only get if you implemented that tracking tag. And I think we're going to see something similar happen where Google is going to not be investing much in progressing universal analytics. And so they may not make it go away. In fact, I mean, you can still use the old synchronous tracking tag, but but it's going to be super limiting if you don't upgrade. So or if you don't use the new version. So I think that's the way that things are going to go. So don't be alarmed like, holy crap, when are they going to shut it down? I really don't see that happening. But they've already started to do some really cool stuff in GA4 that they're not adding to Universal Analytics, and we'll talk about that. I've got tips on the bottom of these slides. Chris mentioned these slides are available as a handout. So you don't have to note this down, but I have a link later on to lovesdata.com, and that's Benjamin Mangold is lovesdata.com, and I love his stuff. He just does a great job of making putting things in a way that's easy to understand, having real examples, walking through how to set up things. And he has a GA4 mini course. I believe it's like $75. He also has a more complete course. It's like $225. Both of them are completely worth it. So another reason to switch from an e-commerce standpoint, I would say e-commerce reporting in GA4 is better than other aspects of reporting, but more importantly, they've introduced a bunch of new metrics that are super exciting. So one of them is because they have really gone to this kind of more of a user focus in the data model than a session focus, they've introduced a whole bunch of metrics related to users, and this is true for more than just e-commerce related metrics. But so I've got examples of some of these here, and I mean, you can look at them and start to see, oh my goodness, like that sounds super cool. So one of the challenges we've had forever with analytics is like understanding lifetime value, understanding consumer behavior, like repeat purchase behavior. You know, you could go into the conversion paths data, and try to make sense of it. But now we have these built-in metrics, like if somebody comes to your site, purchases, comes back within 2 to 7 days, 1 day repeat purchases is interesting. Like I wonder what products people buy every day online, but certainly the 8 to 30, 31 to 90 are super interesting for most people that sell stuff online. That really helps you start to understand, like that's a great metric when you think about KPIs, like growing that metric, like the percentage of your users that are repeat purchasers. That means that your efforts to cultivate customers, remarket, build customer loyalty are succeeding. So I love that metric. Another, I mean, along these same lines, we also have data that's based on user first visit stuff, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. But by that, what I mean is being able to see performance metrics based on like the first time somebody came to your website, like what was the source medium, for example. Another cool thing from an e-commerce standpoint is the near real-time integration with Google Ads. So if you have to be a pretty geeked out Google Ads and analytics user to have observed this, but there's a big lag between when a purchase gets tracked in Google Analytics versus when it shows up in Google Ads. And there's two reasons why that's frustrating. One is that if you're working with a client where it's Black Friday or something, like that data is not available in Google Ads until Black Friday is over, which is pretty, I mean, some of it'll be available, but you won't be able to really understand how things went until it's over. So in some of those like promotional, like this is a really important day times, it's super frustrating. But more importantly, Google has really pushed so much of what they're doing over to machine learning approaches where we can, let Google optimize bids based on a variety of signals, which includes signals that are very time-based. And so when there's this big lag between when Google Ads gets conversion data and when the conversion happened, that's going to confuse those signals. So we're giving the machine learning algorithms much better information if we have this real-time data. I think that's another big one. And then the last one is no more last click attribution. I'll talk about that in a few slides, but in Google Analytics, probably all know the sort of tragic flaw, which is that it attributes conversions to the last thing that somebody clicked on. And from a marketing standpoint, that's a terrible way of looking at things, that we really want to understand sort of what are the different interactions that led to a conversion, not just say, well, the last thing somebody did is a branded organic search, and so we're going to give all of our conversion credit to organic search and branded keywords. Not that you can see organic keywords when you're reporting on conversions, but that is the underlying truth, is that typically in Google Analytics, you're going to see a lot of stuff that shows up as organic. And the reason for that, well, a contributing factor is the fact that people are more likely to search, just type a business name in the nav bar in Google, and so it'll show up as a branded search in many, many cases. Another reason is if you're really trying to get your data house in order and get your different marketing sources into one place, what used to only be available if you paid for Google Analytics 360, which is like a 100K plus subscription, now you get it for free with GA4, and it literally is just like a checkbox to say, I mean, you have to have access to a BigQuery project, and you have to have credentials to do it. But assuming that you have those things, then it's a trivial setup to get the data pushed into BigQuery. And unlike the Google Analytics measurement protocol API, there's no sampling or normalization, that we actually get to see raw data, which is super exciting. And especially when you combine that with the ability to create whatever events and parameters that you want, you get that raw user level data, which is amazingly cool. A little tip here, GA4BigQuery.com has some really great both blog posts but resources for, okay, great, I've got the data in BigQuery, now what do I do with it? And a great jumping off point. But BigQuery is helpful if you have the resources to do SQL analysis, and ultimately, hopefully, combine that with other data sources. Something that we're doing, which I'm really excited about, is combining landing page data from Google Analytics with Search Console data using the Search Console API, and that's, now we get to see, okay, what are the keywords that people are seeing in search engines, what are they clicking on, and then what is their behavior when they land on the site? We can join those two things, which is amazing, as an example. Customizability, I've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to emphasize, and I'll just talk through a couple of examples of things that I've worked on. So I guess first thing, again, we're moving away from this page view focused model of where the main hit type is a page view. Now it's really, it's user interactions of every sort, and there's not a hierarchy of user interactions. So if, like, a really simple example is that a lot of websites have gone to a headless site architecture where I mean, in some cases, page views don't even happen at all. Like, there's an initial page load, but that's it. And so now, and the way that you got around that with Universal Analytics was to fake page views. But now you can just say, well, I don't need to fake page views. What is it that I want to track? What are users doing on my website? That's one example. But so just talking through a couple of things that I've done. So I worked with a client who basically has a very niche search engine for, it's basically a research search engine for people in the restaurant industry to be able to research sort of menu ideas and what foods are trending, and sort of a vast, everything that somebody in that business would want to know. So we, in their case, like, it wasn't about marketing, it wasn't about page views, it was really about what are people searching for, what are they clicking on, how many results are they getting, or how far are they scrolling through the results, like all these different, like, very specific metrics around how people are engaging with a search engine, and that was all fairly straightforward to do in GA4. So now we can report on things based on what did somebody search on, and then based on that search term and the search results, what are the most clicked on results, what is the content types, really all the different types of search engagement that you can imagine. Another one that I like, I mean, this is really basic when it would apply to a lot of websites, is that with Universal Analytics, it was fairly typical that what you would do is you would go in Tag Manager, and in each form on a website, you would set up as an event. And so you'd have like the event category is form, the action is submit, and the label is contact or something like that. And then you'd have a bunch of different events set up. Well, in GA4, you can just create a form submit event and then use parameters for everything else. So now it just makes things a lot cleaner. But then you can add all these different parameters. So if you wanted to say, like, did the person submitting fill out optional fields, for example? Certainly, as with Universal Analytics, you don't want to be collecting personally identifiable information in Google Analytics, violation of terms and conditions. But you can collect things like what things did a person fill out. Potentially, if you have user ID, you can collect, you can add that, a variety of things. And so just simplifying that idea that really what we care about is a form submit, and then in the reporting we can see, well, what are the different forms, and potentially information about, like, did the form not validate, did a person not include specific information. So much easier to do comprehensive form tracking. Another interesting one that I've worked on is calendar interactions, and I did this with a website that did like tracked like personal training and like physical fitness classes, and so being able to get down to, okay, when does somebody actually view a calendar of events? When they click on an event, if they click on an event and there's a specific trainer, like we could associate the specific trainer with, so we can know how many times people book classes with specific trainers, how many times people look at classes but then choose not to book, how many times people take advantage of a free class versus actually signing up. So getting, again, in this case, it wasn't really about page views. It was about, like, are people engaging with this calendar and what are they doing? Really initially it was built for tracking mobile apps. I'm not going to go into everything to do with mobile apps. Honestly, it's not really my area of expertise, but it is built for that. So you can track all kinds of engagement within both Android and iOS mobile apps. Another thing that I think is crazy cool is you can create events from behavior sequences. So if you wanted to say that when somebody, say, watches a video and then engages with somebody in a chat session, like you could turn that into an event. Or if there's a specific path that you are interested in, well, I guess that is a specific path, but if you think about like paths or different types of engagement, like people that were clicked on a promotional email and then later on ended up filling out the contact us form, you could define that as an event. I don't feel like I'm doing a great job explaining this because honestly, I haven't fully got my head around it. It is like it's so flexible that I think we're so used to thinking in terms of page views, and I'm still getting my head around this sort of post page view model of things. I'll also mention just that because the architecture is so flexible, I expect that we're going to start to see like smart devices and stuff be integrated with GA4, so that, like, if somebody interacts with their refrigerator, that's a GA4, that can be a GA4 event, and people starting to use like analytics for a lot more than just, did somebody come to my website? I do have a couple bonus reasons, but the last reason I'll focus on is the So I've been talking about how it's fairly complicated to set up. You can do everything super flexible, and that sounds kind of intimidating. But the other thing I would say is that you get a lot more than you get from Universal Analytics if all you do is enable the basic tracking tag, which is something that you really could do in 15 minutes in Data Studio. I mean, in Tag Manager. So there's like, so I have examples of some of what the tracking that you get. So yes, you get page views, but you also get scroll tracking built in without having to set that up. That's something that we really love to set up for our clients, is scroll tracking, so you can see, like, if you're optimizing a blog post, are people scrolling down and actually reading the content in the blog post? Outbound clicks, so this is great for social media. So let's say that you have links to content on Facebook or LinkedIn or somewhere else, to have to be able to see when users actually leave your site and where they go, and that's built in. Previously, that was something that you would have had to set up to track. Site search, sort of built in, still something you had to configure in Universal Analytics. Now it's a built-in thing, even though there's not a built-in report. Same thing with video engagement, file download. So these are all things that just happen. Like, you don't have to do anything, and they start tracking. I mean, I will say with videos, depends on what platform you're using to serve videos on your website. If you're using YouTube, if you're using Vimeo, it'll work. There is a little bit of, you have to make sure that a setting is set in the YouTube, the embed code, but typically if you're using a WordPress or something like that, it'll automatically do it the right way to place videos on the website. So again, last thing, like, just to say, yes, complicated and advanced, but if all you're going to do is just stick a page view tracking tag in Universal Analytics versus the equivalent in GA4 is the GA4 configuration tag, then I would do the latter, because you're going to get more without doing anything else. A couple other reasons to switch. I mentioned attribution and moving away from the last click attribution. Honestly, I don't know. Back when they announced GA4, and they talked about this back then, it took them a while to actually release it. I was like, finally, God, I've been waiting for this for so freaking long. I mean, this alone, I think, is a huge reason, especially if you're marketing focused, to be, and who here is not somewhat marketing focused? Probably be kind of weird if you're here if you're not. But so the default model now is cross-channel data driven. So being able to understand the different interactions that people do before making a purchase or submitting a lead form or whatever the conversion is, and how all the different channels contribute to that conversion. And if you use Google Ads much, they've had this model in Google Ads for a while. Much better way of thinking about things. If you don't want to trust Google's data-driven model, you could use position-based. That's what I've often recommended in the past. I like that because it puts the most weight on the first thing. So what this means is, like, if somebody hears about a website via Facebook, and then they leave, they come back via Google search, a Google ad, and then they leave, and then they come back via a whatever organic search. All of those get some attribution of the conversion. So it's not like they're triple counting. It's that the conversion is getting the credit for the conversion is being split between those different sources. I mentioned Google Ads conversion syncing, that it's essentially real time, super exciting. There are a bunch of user level dimensions. So we get to see things like source and medium based on the user, which means the first time the user came to the website, what source and medium did they come from? I love that. And then they keep making it better and better. So that's the other thing, is they're definitely progressing GA4 a lot. I mean, they have made some updates to Universal Analytics, but most of the really cool stuff they're introducing is happening in GA4. If you search GA4, what's new, you'll see Google's release notes. That's the first result, assuming you're searching in Google. I assume it would be the same thing in Bing or DuckDuckGo or wherever. But in any case, it's pretty cool just to see all the things that they're adding. Reasons not to transition: your website platform or third-party integrations don't fully support GA4. So I've run into this. Like, with a few platforms. An example, and again, maybe this has changed, but if you use Calendly widgets on your website, it's fairly easy to integrate them with Universal Analytics. Last I knew, not with GA4. There's a bunch of third-party integrations that I think haven't caught up yet. The big ones, like you definitely can, if you're using Shopify, if you're using really most major e-commerce platforms, you can. So, and in many cases, you could work around this with Tag Manager. So if you're like, I really want to, like, I'm excited about GA4, I want to do it, you can probably get around a lot of that with Tag Manager, maybe all the limitations. It just means a little bit more work versus being able to just go into the admin and just plug in a tracking code. You might have to do a little bit more setup in Tag Manager. Another big reason is that if you don't have the resources. So like I said, the basic setup's super easy, but if you have a website that's been around for a while and you're tracking a lot of events and conversions, it's non-trivial to get things set up in GA4. So I would not recommend transitioning until you're ready. Now, that said, there is definitely, like, arguably, I would recommend just going ahead and setting up a property, getting the configuration tag going so that at least there's some data in there. So doing that sooner than later, even if you're not really investing the time to get it set up properly. But what I wouldn't do is kind of botch it and try to get things set up. It is pretty frustrating if you set up events the wrong way, because that data is going to be in there in some cases forever. So it is worth making sure that you're getting things mostly right when you set it up. I guess I should mention, we love helping. So if you are like, yeah, I'm excited, but we need help. I personally, and 2Octobers helps people with all aspects of analytics, including getting GA4 properties set up and training actually on GA4. So boils down to better to start collecting data in most cases, even if it's going to be a slow transition to getting everything set up properly. Okay, planning the transition. I'm going to go through this. Like I said, the goal here is not to have you feeling confident that you know everything you need to do, just to give you a feeling for it. So, and sort of based on time, I want to move through this fairly quickly. So first off, this is what I usually see when I go into somebody's GA4 account is flatline. And the reason for that is that somebody's gone and followed Google's steps for setting up a GA4 property, but they didn't actually do the configuration in Tag Manager at all or correctly. So it I guess just to say, a little forethought, a little education is going to be necessary. So the first thing is you will need somebody that has expertise. Now, again, if all you're doing is getting the configuration tag going, not that hard, but you're not going to get most of the benefits of GA4 if you do it that way. So you really will want to have either through a partner like us or through somebody on your team, somebody that has the expertise. Just to give you an idea, the bare bone setup is really simple, but generally, if you have if you're doing a lot of event tracking in your Universal Analytics account, it could easily be 40 to 80 hours. And in addition to that, I guess, so the note at the bottom here, like I have spent a lot of time figuring stuff out, and I mean, I've been using Google Analytics forever. I'm certainly would consider myself advanced in my knowledge, and it still takes me a lot of time to figure out how to do some things. So non-trivial. I mentioned Loves Data, Benjamin Mangold before. He's got a ton of free content on YouTube, and plus some courses. The courses actually, to a large extent, just organize some of his free content, but there is content available in the courses that's not in the the stuff that's available on YouTube. But it's still worth it just for $225 to have it all nicely organized with a curriculum to go through and everything is worth it. And he really will actually help you. If you have questions, you get to talk to Benjamin. I mean, you can chat, he has ways that you can interact with him and ask him questions, which is super cool. So he makes lively and engaging videos. To his right is analyticsmania.com. I'm not even going to try to tackle his last name, but he is brilliant. I love his stuff. He's got little less personality than Benjamin Mangold. So his videos are less engaging. He has a course on Tag Manager, which has some great stuff in it. But mostly I've relied on his posts on how to do things in GA4 are unbelievably detailed, and he keeps them up to date, which I love. And then, as I mentioned, I am a resource. We are a resource as well. So the things that you're gonna have to plan for are, I mean, this is laying it out. I have a link to the worksheet at the bottom, which is, but then it's also in the handout section. And it talks through some of the settings, but so we may look at that in a second, but maybe I'll save that to the end. But so migrating events is the big part, and you really should lay it all out. Probably, I mean, in the worksheet I have it so that you could do it in text, but ultimately you're probably going to take a spreadsheet and just sort of map, like, this is what I have in Universal Analytics. This is where it's going to go in GA4, because it isn't going to be a one-to-one mapping. So, and I say here that think in terms of verbs when you create events in GA4. So the events that you have in, like, if you've used the event action field in Universal Analytics to be an action, to actually be a verb, then that's probably going to be the event name or something like it. That's going to map to an event in GA4. And nouns are usually going to be parameters. So what I've found is people kind of mix these things up. And really think in terms of a thing that happens is an event, and then we can pile on pretty much as many parameters as we want. So you'll also want to make sure to plan to migrate goals, which in some cases might be specific page views, and you will need to do a bit of setup to create events for those specific page views in GA4 so that they can be tracked as conversions. The way that GA4 works is that any event can be flagged as a conversion. So if you imagine, so let's just say you have a specific page view. It's a thank you page for a contact form submit, as an example. Well, you don't want to just say, well, page views are a conversion. That doesn't make sense, because that means every page view in your website will be a conversion. So what you have to do is you have to create, essentially, it's like a child event of that page view event, where it's a page view of, so you could just do page underscore view underscore contact or something like that. That is the instance when somebody viewed a page, but it is the thank you contact form thank you page, and then you flag that as a conversion. So you do have to plan through that as well. For systems wise, you're going to do really most of the setup in Tag Manager. If you, for whatever reason, don't use Tag Manager, and then certainly you have to, well, you have no choice with GA4 but to use the GTag format, which is the latest format of the Google Analytics tag. Well, it's not really the Google Analytics tag, it's the cross-platform tag. And if you do it that way and you've set everything up using GTag, you actually, all you have to do to get most things to work in GA4 is to add a configuration for your GA4 account. Probably stay on if any of that made sense to you and you're like, I have questions. If it didn't make sense to you, use Tag Manager. It's going to be easier anyway. But means you're going to have expertise in Tag Manager. Then you're, as I mentioned, you're going to be flagging conversion events in GA4. So you're going to do most of your event setup. You'll get some automatic events when you set up the account, but then anything additional you want to do, like form submits, for example, or chat engagement, for example, you're going to be doing that in Tag Manager. And then you're going to want to go into GA4 and create, in some cases, custom dimensions and metrics. Again, to get the real power of GA4 and flag conversion events. Then, as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of work in Data Studio. In my opinion, I would just recommend planning for that versus beating your head against the wall and trying to get the built-in reporting to do what you want. And certainly somebody from Google would not like me saying that, but that's been my experience. Is don't waste your time. Go straight to Tag Manager to Data Studio and set up your reports there. And then lastly, the unbelievable ability to sync data with BigQuery. And depending, like, if you are warehousing data, if you have data science resources on your team, then loop them into the whole process. Like getting the data in there is a piece of cake, but what you do with it once it's there is going to take some forethought and planning. So this is really sort of my closing point of view, which is that like we've all spent a ton of money on expertise in Google Ads and Facebook and SEO and building websites and everything. I would argue that nearly everybody has underspent on expertise in analytics. The data revolution is well underway. It's time to treat this as a key skill set on your team or in the partners that you work with. That just expecting your Google Ads person to know enough about analytics is generally not going to be enough. So that's it. I'm going to stick around for questions. Sorry I didn't leave a lot of time before the top of the hour. Probably some of you have to go. Reach out to me if you do with questions, please, please, please. I guess here, just bookmark. It's available to you. Like you have the PDF. Check out our training for upcoming workshops. Here's my contact info. If you have to go, please reach out. I have to give special thanks to Bitmoji. I joke that my superpower is that I look shockingly like my Bitmoji character. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but that's the superpower I got.